Hey everyone, welcome back to A Mouthful of History. As always, I am not your host, Nicholas Malott, but instead I am co-host, David Hollingsworth.
David, that's my line.
I don't think introducing yourself as not the main host, David Hollingsworth, is your line.
Well, catch you in the flippity flop, boys. So we actually have like a live audience behind us. Yeah. You know, brothers, wives, fiancés, Corey in the chair over there.
Our most treasured and just valued in general fan of all.
All around good dude.
Yes. Caroline back there making sure that we don't sound terrible.
Caroline is a real one. I mean, she does manage to somehow make us sound coherent, and I really appreciate that.
If the reason why we sound so good is because of her, and for that, we thank her.
Thank you, Caroline.
Anybody have any questions?
Well, actually, I have a public comment.
Uh-oh. It's someone has more of a comment than a question.
Complaint. The marks you guys talked about was not Groucho in the last episode.
So for those...
Disappointed with it. That's why you want to tune in. Put F in the chat.
So for those of you who didn't hear, we have a comment more than a question from Cameron's brother, Alex. And he is upset that the marks that we were talking about in our latest episode was not Groucho, but instead our boy Carl.
Yeah, I mean, we totally missed that. I mean, fat mustache, cigar.
We had nothing but Beatles jokes.
Lenin's John.
We had nothing but Beatles jokes, but when we got to Marx, it was all business. There was no Groucho, no nothing. Come on.
Well, when I call myself a Marxist, I am actually talking about Groucho Marx. It is my firm belief that the proletariat should be armed with mustaches and just be really good at like slapstick humor because life is a horrifying pain, and the more that we can be really silly, the better it is.
Like Groucho Marx, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keegan.
So that is my leftist tendency. I am a Marxist
Keaton. Buster Keaton. Shout out to all the silent actors out there.
Yeah, shout out to my boy Chaplin.
Who did a great job of transitioning just fine from silent to talkies.
Oh yeah, definitely. And the thing is, he got unfairly blacklisted by America, and we put an F in the chat for Charles.
I feel like if you weren't blacklisted in the 1950s, then you were fucking up, man. Like you just weren't living the right kind of life.
You were a shill. you were a corporate shill,
right? Or just like the safest, blandest, least helpful to humanity type of person there was.
Speaking of bland, useless members of
the
society,
Romanovs,
Henry Kissinger.
Either one of those would be acceptable answers, but. Yeah, Henry Kissinger, still alive.
What sacrifices has he done to stay alive this long?
I am of the belief that pure evil, you just get that power, just keeps you going forever.
You're just like Emperor Palpatine.
he has those midichlorians that are like,
oh Jesus,
Darth Plagueis the Wise.
Okay,
John Lewis died before Henry Kissinger.
What a fucking hell world where John Lewis dies before Henry Kissinger.
The good die young. It's like
I mean, if Young is 78 years old,
78. I'm 78 years old.
Okay, I do actually have a conspiracy theory that I believe in my heart of hearts, though. And that is the fact that the ruling class performed some sort of ritual where instead of, all of them at some point experiencing COVID, they've used Jair Bolsonaro from Brazil as a sacrificial lamb so that anytime any of them would have gotten COVID, Bolsonaro just gets COVID for the 75th time.
They also drink demon semen.
I mean they're talking about that as far as I know. I mean, that's not even a fake thing.
by the time this episode releases, no one's gonna get that reference anymore.
No one.
But I mean, what's great about what I said a second ago though is by the time the episode releases, Bolsonaro probably will have gotten COVID again
4 times.
It's just gonna be an evergreen joke about Bolsonaro having COVID.
He's giving the middle finger to coronavirus. I got it 3 times. It's
Also, he got attacked by emus, I believe, twice.
Why won't he die? We here at A Mouthful of History do not generally wish death on too many people, but Jair Bolsonaro can go fuck himself.
Yeah, Bolsonaro and Kissinger and Cheney can just all go lick doorknobs into oblivion.
in any right-wing South American dictator.
Yes. I'm
To go
glad
to hell.
Pinochet is dead.
Anyway, should we get back to Russia?
I suppose we should.
Let's take a hard left turn if you know what I'm saying.
Oh, that was
Oh,
slick.
All right.
So
You gonna interrupt me before I do my intro?
yes, Nick.
Welcome back to A Mouthful of History. I am, as always, your host, Nicholas Malat. Joined with me, Cameron, not knowing his role,
Hey, how we doing this evening?
and David.
What's proppin', y'all? What's proppin'? Wow, what's poppin'?
David, you're fucking up right now.
I fucked up in the first 5 minutes.
Hey, we have an audience full of people willing to take your spot if you can't get your shit together.
Oh, shit. I think it was the amaretto.
All right, next man up. Alex.
It's okay. Kat can take my place. I trust her.
So Nick, what were we drinking tonight?
You and I were enjoying an AleSmith 394, the hazy version. Delicious.
Tropical.
I'm just over
Fruity.
here drinking amaretto straight
Because
like a fool.
because he has hair in his chest.
Yeah, baby.
No, he doesn't. I have hair on my chest.
Excuse me, sir, but check this out.
Look at mine. I'm like, whoa.
That's not your chest. Cameron, I don't know how well you did it in middle school health class, but that was not your chest.
I don't want to unbutton the top of it.
Just so you all know, that was his stomach, by the way. He didn't. That sounded a little suggestive. That was his stomach. That wasn't anything else.
Am I flashing my plums at you?
I mean, like, to someone listening and just hearing that wasn't your stomach, I mean,
Hard right
it's
turn.
kind of left to the imagination.
Hard right turn. Chest, penis. Like, look at the hair on this thing. Look at the.
All right. So last time we talked about the lead up to the Russian Revolution, introduced Lenin, and talked a little bit about universal waste of space that was the Romanovs.
Okay, Nick, we get it. You hate the Romanovs.
Fuck the Romanovs. Really, like I said, fuck any royal family, but really the Romanovs.
I think Nick feels the same way about the Romanovs that I do about the British family, and also just the British in general.
That's not a wrong opinion.
Look, I'm sorry. If you're listening to this podcast and you are not Idris Elba or an employee of the NHS, then I'm not interested in you.
What about
I'm very sorry.
what about the grime scene? UK's got some hard hitting rappers right now.
Okay, I'll make an exception for that.
Don't worry,
too.
David. Cameron and I know anybody who is English who listens to this podcast.
Unless you're an Arsenal fan. Arsenal fans, Chelsea fans, West Ham fans, United fans.
Oh, but this will come out like 4 weeks after the events. But fuck you, Chelsea. You couldn't do one thing right.
Fuck Chelsea. Fuck Arsenal. Fuck West Ham. Any London club besides the mighty Spurs can go in a ditch.
I mean, I agree just because they're all British, but I don't really know what you're talking about right now.
That's okay. We don't really have time to spend.
No,
explaining
we
it to
don't.
you. All right. So obviously, previously the Russians were reeling. They had invested heavily in the Crimean and war with Japan. Both instances were bad. They starved their own people, and of course, there was the events of Bloody Sunday. Luckily for them, everything was fine, perfect, and going well. Of course, that is until 1914, and war broke out.
For a second, I thought you said that Russia invested heavily in the Cretaceous period.
But anyway, as Nick was just saying, everything was fine and would have been fine unless war were declared. And
Yeah.
what happened?
War were declared.
So we enter World War I. So remember last episode we said Russia backed up the Serbians against the Austro-Hungarians?
Yeah.
Well, this turned into a full-on world conflict, hence world in front of war.
This is
what that
world.
meant.
This is
That's
World War.
what that meant. That's for those of you listening. That's what that meant. So the thing is, Russia was not as industrialized as the rest of the European countries because they got like everyone had a 100-meter like head start, especially Germany. So the Russians were poorly equipped, poorly manned, it's crap equipment, crap weapons, crap supplies. They were being cut down by German machine guns regularly. And they were losing a lot of lives, losing a lot of casualties, and soldiers started to disobey orders because of it.
Always a good sign.
Yeah, also, it's important to note that Nicholas II was taking personal command of military at the front. While all this is happening, back in Russia, there's still heavy starvation. Food is going directly to the soldiers. What food there is going to the soldiers. This is basically painting Nicholas as somebody who is more interested in European affairs than he is at the suffering of his own people.
Because there is Rasputin. No,
And yeah,
Rasputin.
Yeah.
Some like wizard in the backwoods of Russia
Just constantly defying death. That's honestly all I know about him.
Constantly defying death. Like, he helped the Tsarina's son deal with his hemophilia, so he got power in the government because of it.
Yeah, basically he's almost like shadow controlling everything. Kind of.
Shadow influence.
Like, the nobles didn't like him. He was making decisions in power while Nick was at the front line. Not Nick Malat, but Nick Romanov. And
if I was in charge, I would have been really simple. Yeah, we're not doing it.
So at the end of the day, like, his weird wizard dude, backwoods guy, comes out of nowhere, becomes a big part of the royal family, and the nobles kill him.
You gotta note that Rasputin wasn't popular amongst the Russian masses, but the royal family thought if they got rid of Rasputin and that influence, that would save face amongst the general populace. It didn't. Usually by this point, the damage has been done.
The people's attitudes towards the Russian royal family were already, like, sown. There was no coming back from this because of the food shortages. Lives are being lost by the ton in World War I. So Rasputin leaves the scene. And for a fun fact for our listeners, his Katusha rocket of a penis is
still preserved.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes.
Somebody cut it off as a trophy.
I don't even have a quip for that. I don't even know what to say.
David's stunned.
Yeah.
He's like, damn.
I mean, I hope that I can leave a legacy in this world where that happens to me too, I guess.
And like, you're so popular that your penis is preserved in, like,
it's like in a museum.
The Bowers Museum.
The British just like steal it from my tomb. Because they steal everything.
Things get so bad that Nicholas is forced to come back to deal with the outbreak of just riots that are now happening. It's generally a bad sign for power when the people who are supposed to police the citizens throw down their arms and join the protesters.
Yeah, that usually does not end well.
Well, yeah, and that we going back to what Lenin was doing in England, like, they created their political party, the Marxist Social Democratic Labor Party. The Bolsheviks are created in 1903 with Alexander Bogdanov. They were the radical leftist group that was based on the values of Marx. So you have the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. That creates that permanent split, and especially with the pamphlet, what needs to be done. So while Russia is losing to the Germans, Lenin returns to Russia.
He returns with the help of the German train helped take him to Russia, and it's really simple. Germany hoped that Lenin would cause enough of a ruckus to divide Russia's attention away from the war. Germany can take their time, basically focus on the Western Front, because it's super simple. Bismarck had long said that the easiest way to lose a war is to divide it into two fronts, and Germany was doing that at that moment.
And so if you throw Lenin back into Russia, the seeds of discord are already there. So Lenin's going to cause a ruckus. So Germany's like, all right, go back to Russia, Big Daddy Vladdy. And
Big Daddy Vladdy.
Big Daddy Vladdy. That is an homage to Vladimir Guerrero, Senior, not Junior. So basically now, the royal family is on the ropes, as if they already were. And so I think we need to talk about the split with Marxism with Vladimir Lenin. I think we need to talk about that split.
Yeah, so what we said the last episode, Lenin started off as a traditional Marxist. His views on Marxism he would start to develop his own views on Marxism, very tailor-made to Russia specifically, because Marx would not have viewed Russia as the kind of country that would have had that communist revolution, because they weren't industrialized. In fact, Marx was thinking more along the lines of England or Germany, countries that had a booming middle class and an exploited working class.
A really industrialized country.
Basically,
like Germany or England.
Yeah, basically a country in mid-stage capitalism, essentially.
But Lenin is an accelerationist. Like the Bolsheviks, they wanted revolution and they wanted now.
And they also kind of, in retrospect, one thing that a lot of people have said is because capitalism wasn't as entrenched in Russia, there also wasn't a sort of reformist capital, like there weren't strongly established groups of like reformists who could absorb the energy of people who want to change but not completely change
like
the
you had the
system.
Mensheviks who wanted to do through political means, like they wanted the incrementalists, like the moderates. Like it's probably the closest as we'll probably get to something like that. So we see Russia as not a super industrial country. So then this is kind of like the outlier for what Marx believed in. We have to go into now the beginnings of the revolution.
Or wait, should I talk about the pamphlet though? because it's around the time.
Let's talk about the pamphlet.
Yeah. Also, real quick, another thing I think that helped guide Lenin's split was Lenin was heavily influenced by the German Socialist Party. The German Socialist Party supported the German war effort in World War One. Lenin was of the mind that the socialists had an obligation to not support what he viewed as an imperialist conflict. The proletariat should reject this. Now, if you know anything about World War One, you know that it's very high nationalism, and so it was kind of hard to be anti-war. But Lenin truly believed that you can't be a Marxist and support World War One. David?
Yeah, which wasn't popular at the time, but kind of gradually gained popularity as an outlook as World War One just generally lost popularity.
We now know almost 100 years later that World War One is probably the dumbest conflict that has ever been fought.
So pointless.
War,
and with all that
yeah.
bloodshed and death.
Anyway, David, the pamphlet.
So I mentioned it in passing in the last episode, but I was at a used bookstore about a week ago, a little bit more than a week, and saw this Lenin book for like $5, and so I figured I'd pick it up because we were doing this episode. And so Lenin wrote this book in 1916 and published it in 1917, so kind of when, World War I was approaching its end. And it's called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And so just to kind of sum up the main ideas in the book or pamphlet, because I think it was released as a pamphlet or series of pamphlets, but he distinguished between earlier capitalism and modern, by the standards of the early 1900s when he wrote it, modern for the time capitalism, where earlier capitalism was primarily about free markets, competition between burgeoning industries, and the exchange of goods. But by the early 1900s, most of the major industries of each country were controlled by just a couple companies each. So, for example, like if we're talking about steel or energy or something in, the US or Germany or Great Britain, in any of those countries, there's only a couple major companies per industry.
Like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel.
Exactly. Perfect examples. And so there's not really competition happening in the same way, because if you're trying to create your own company, you're facing this just monumentally uphill task in trying to make up for your lack of resources and capital and everything to catch up with them. And just realistically, you can't really do it. You have this consolidation of industry. In addition to that, the financial sector, the most interesting and sexy sector there is becoming increasingly important as stuff like loans, stocks, bonds, financial speculation, and all of that stuff that I totally understand was becoming super intertwined with these monopolies in different countries. And so as you have this new structure of monopolies and the financial capital that is supporting them, they are dividing the world among themselves. So, for example, British companies and British finance gets control over India, over Egypt, and all the other places that Britain has colonized or has influence in. France, the same with their colonies. Germany has a sort of burgeoning influence on Latin America. The United States does as well, especially for the United States and the Caribbean and Central America. You have then imperialism emerging as a primarily financial force that's actually based a lot in finance capital that is backed up by force, which is a little different than how we normally think of it. We normally think of imperialism as invasion, but Lenin is defining it basically as finance economics that is, sinking its tendrils into different colonies and enriching the colonizing countries. But in this, Lenin makes the distinction that imperialism is supported not just by the ruling class of these colonizing powers, but they make deals with the local ruling classes, say Argentina or Egypt or India or wherever. And then also for the working class that's back home, let's say the British, for example, because I love talking shit about the British, their industries are benefiting so much from all the materials as well as the finance capital that's being generated from this economic imperialism that a portion of the proletariat, of the working class, is actually going to support imperialism as well, and that helps divide the working class. And also, just to kind of end off about this work, just the entire time he is talking shit about reformists. He doesn't believe that reforms can really act as a adequate counterweight to any of this. He basically looks at it as trying to construct a, and he doesn't say this in the book, this is just how I conceptualized it. He kind of looks at it as like trying to build a dam out of very skinny sticks to stop a raging flood.
So he kind of saw himself as all or nothing sort of like proposition, as opposed to like, oh, we'll put this like beer can here to stop.
Exactly. Yeah. Like he basically thought that like with the way that capitalism is structured, it inevitably leads to the financialization of capitalism, to the monopolization of industries. And from there, they're going to divvy up the world. They're going to have conflict over who gets to control more, because capitalism is always about exponential growth. And so he just doesn't see it as possible to halt that with any reforms.
Yeah, very much against incrementalism, basically. And he didn't really believe that you could achieve most of this electorally.
Exactly.
Back on the government side, the February or March Revolution, depending on which calendar you're looking at, I believe the Russians are still using the
Julian calendar.
So that breaks out, and that's the Tsar is forced to abdicate.
But then the reason why for the revolution is that citizens marched on St. Petersburg demanding bread along with striking industrial workers. So the same still problems that keep coming up. And the Tsar has done nothing. Again, he sicks the soldiers on the protesters. They shoot them. Protesters stand firm. They're like, we're not backing down. And the soldiers, realizing like, hey, I might be shooting a family member or a friend or something like that, they join the side of the protest. So like when you lose the military, you're done. That's it. Well, it's like Honecker in East Germany. Like he lost the police, he lost the military. He had to step down after that. Like once you lose those two apparati.
Yeah, when the people who are supposed to be enforcing your rules don't enforce your rules, you don't have rules anymore.
So the Duma establishes a provisional government, and then, to Nick's happiness, arrests the Romanovs.
Good. Now, they're treated, I mean, they're prisoners, but they're still treated fine. They just don't really know what to do with them yet.
It's like when Louis' family was arrested in the French Revolution. Some said, oh, we might still need a king. We just want a constitutional monarchy. We had the Jacobins saying, no, let's just cut his head off and just start anew.
So it's because of all this that Lenin decides that like this is the perfect time to reestablish himself as the leader of the Bolsheviks.
But then the royal family is executed.
But they're not executed till the Russian Civil War.
Oh, who cares? They already got it.
The Romanovs will be executed.
So don't worry, everyone.
Don't worry. If you're excited for that, sorry for the spoiler.
Lenin, upon his arrival, delivers his 10 theses. I should have written them down. I did not. They're basically his outline for revolution. You've actually covered a lot of what generally
he kind of said.
What he generally
yeah, I mean,
said.
this was probably less than a year after he wrote the work that I was just talking about. So, I mean, I can't imagine it's radically different.
This is basically the formation of Leninism. This is Lenin's specific brand of Marxism. But the February-March revolution is just a precursor to the bigger revolution. That's the October Revolution.
But then also a big fact, because we have the provisional government in power right now. The royal family, well, these October revolutions when the Bolsheviks take over. Right now, since the Romanov family is in power, the Mensheviks take over. They become the provisional government, the moderates.
Yeah.
What happens now is that the royal family is executed. Basically, the Mensheviks do is they sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So this is the treaty in which the Russians pull themselves out of World War I. Lenin sees this as a travesty of justice because a third of the Russian population is out of the empire, and they had to give up Ukraine, Georgia, Finland, gave up Poland, the states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to Germany.
My favorite countries.
And Austria-Hungary ceded Kars, Ardahan, Batum to Turkey. The total losses constituted some 1 million square miles of Russia's former territory, according to History Channel. A third of its population, around 55 million people, a majority of its coal, oil, and iron stores, and much of its industry. Lenin bitterly called the settlement that abyss of defeat, dismemberment, enslavement, and humiliation.
Real quick though, I believe the Romanovs weren't killed during this time, but
Eventually.
by Lenin. I know you're really excited
I know,
for
I want
the Romanovs to be murdered, but that actually happens when Lenin has come to power.
They're still alive at this point.
Yeah, fucking hell. I've already told this they're dead twice.
You're just really glad to see the Romanovs get fucked up.
The
And
thing is,
I respect that.
I'm surprised Nick didn't say what I said. I took the words out of his mouth.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
We'll
Now,
get there.
Lenin arrives and the Bolsheviks start to expand their power in the provisional government. They start taking over. Lenin and the Bolsheviks formally, in the October Revolution, overthrow the provisional government in October of 1917. Now, it should be noted that Lenin really didn't have a desire to be a head of state. He actually called for Trotsky to be the chairman.
Why is that?
I honestly just think it has a lot to do with his lack of desire to do anything. He clearly comes off as like a philosopher. He has a lot of high-minded ideas, but he doesn't really have he knows what he wants. He just doesn't. He's uncomfortable being
the main person
in charge. And quite honestly, it's clear basically on what we know about Trotsky, especially later. Trotsky is better suited for government.
Yeah, he was a very good public speaker too.
He was a giant nerd and a giant organizer.
Yeah, and he wore some pretty good glasses.
He was the revolutionary Colonel Sanders.
Okay, oh yeah, he was.
Just a little bit about Leninism. So Leninism would establish a socialist state that would gradually evolve into communism. This is basic Marxism. The difference is Leninism calls for a vanguard party, basically a vanguard socialist party that would lead the masses. Mostly, Lenin also believed that representative democracy in capitalism gave only the illusion of democracy, but in practice was a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Economically, Lenin would allow for limited capitalism, whereas it's needed to grow industry.
Because I think he let some of the kulaks own their own land and make their own food and sell it for themselves. That was one of his things that he did.
Ultimately, the role of the party is to educate and allow for self-determination. And then two things that are separate from this is that both Stalin and Trotsky, in their own views, would try to claim Leninism as their own, that they were the true heirs to Leninism, and that Leninist Marxism is the standard by which most modern Marxist parties and movements around the world would gravitate to.
Yeah, so we have to talk about ultimately Lenin takes on the responsibility for being the head of state.
So now Lenin's in charge. He is the guy.
Yep. And so obviously Russia goes through just a giant slew of changes. So I've listed, a number of some of the biggest ones, both good and bad, because you do have to reckon with both. He does turn the Soviet Union into a one-party state. So it saw even other leftist groups and left parties as potential bourgeois reformers and opportunists, rather than just being, leftists who had their own way of how to achieve things. So there was I don't want to say no diversity of thought, because anytime you have a governing apparatus in any government whatsoever, there are going to be different ways of looking at things. But I mean, as far as we're concerned, this was not a pluralistically or super diverse way of governing. He nationalized the land held by the landed aristocracy and the Orthodox Church, and so he established that among the people, or he distributed that among the people, rather. He sent out a decree on the press that outlawed opposition media, which was actually criticized not even by just people outside of the left, but actually a lot of people within the left.
That makes sense, because that's a czar move. Oh, you don't like what I'm saying? You're done.
Exactly. And even not even just leftists criticized that, but Bolsheviks criticized it. So not a cool move, bro. So this is an interesting one because it was kind of inconsistently applied. He allowed some areas with nationalist sentiments to actually secede from Russia and create their own nations, which is pretty cool, except there were some places, such as the Ukraine and different places in the Caucasus, that they did not actually follow through on that rhetoric and did not allow for secession.
Well, because Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, and the Caucasus have oil.
Yeah, right? There's these resources that are super valuable. But
capitalist.
Going into some other better policies, he created the 8-hour workday. He created universal public education for all children, as well as publicly funded orphanages.
His wife was actually very big in pushing education policy because she was a school teacher for the new Lenin government.
That's awesome. Yeah, and that does go, back to how sometimes, we'll say First Lady, even though I'm sure that wasn't her title in this system. Sometimes the spouses of people in charge can push for some very cool things. So we have the 8-hour workday, we have universal public education and orphanages for children. They nationalized the country's gold and banking system so that those aren't driven by profit. Women were also given a lot more rights, including even just the right to divorce, which is not super... It's one of those things that, like, it's kind of legal in some places, but not really. But here, like, women were just allowed to divorce. And as well as have, like, equal pay so that they weren't economically dependent on their husbands. Because, sometimes you can have equal political rights, but if you're bound by a man because you're being treated like a child economically, then you don't really have freedom.
They're also given the right to study mathematics and science and engineering and stuff like that. They got the same privileges to work in the same fields as men as well.
Yeah.
So you do have these cool reforms, but, there's some... Getting to like toward the end of the list of some of the major reforms that I wrote down, there are some other not great ones. He established the Supreme Council of the National Economy, which, I mean, the idea itself is cool. It's a central
Economic policy.
Yeah, a central governing body for economic policy. But the problem is it became the undisputed highest authority on Soviet economic policy. And so, if local worker councils were not in agreement, then the Supreme Council is overruling those local workers. And then finally created the Gulag system, which in theory was to suppress opponents of the revolution, but it was also just used a lot against political dissidents.
It'd become a bigger problem with Stalin.
Oh
Yeah.
boy, would it.
But as it turns out, people aren't always 100% on board with revolution. And Russia is no different.
Like, you can have the ripest peaches in the world, but some people will still not like peaches. That, to quote a teacher colleague of mine.
And so with this going on, Russia, just 4 years from the revolution, devolves into civil war.
Yeah, and so the two factions that are at war with each other are the Reds, which are the Bolsheviks, and then the Whites. And so the Whites are this haphazard coalition of monarchists, of constitutionalists, and even non-Bolshevik leftists.
But the way to look at it is say the Red Army is the Bolsheviks, the White Army are the Mensheviks, because the White Army is led by Alexander Kerensky. And
The former head of the
former head of the provisional government. And fun fact, one of my favorite professors of all time, who I had in history class at Fulton College, and a colleague I still hold near and dear to my heart, she met Kerensky in the 60s or the 70s.
Wow.
She met the head of the provisional government, like,
That's
way
incredible.
back when. So I was like, oh, damn.
Super incredible.
I think you can kind of get at, just looking at this, as to why the Bolsheviks would come out ahead. There's no unifying theory amongst the whites. It's just a haphazard collection of anti-Bolsheviks.
But they did get a lot of fanciful allies, you know what I mean?
They did. And before we get into that, though, yeah, like Nick was saying, you can't have someone who wants to restore the Tsar fighting alongside a socialist and really expect that to work out in the long run. There's just no way that's going to work. There are some great leaders in history who are able to unite different factions under a common cause, but if they are fighting for, like, the exact opposite causes, I mean, there's only so much you can do.
Yeah, so the Civil War is also where Trotsky really starts to shine as a figure, because he's really the guy who organizes the Red Army. It's his battle tactics.
Yeah, and he is just an amazing organizer during this time. And so, in addition to this civil war, there are also isolated uprisings that, some people kind of count it as part of the Great Civil War, but, like, upon further study, they're not really united with the whites or anything like that. They're just their own independent uprisings. And so one such uprising was from the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party in July 1918. The Left Socialist Revolutionary Party was actually kind of the, loosely speaking, the wing of the Mensheviks that still went along with the Bolsheviks through everything up to this point. But when they were outlawed in 1918, despite having worked so long with the Bolsheviks, they rose up against Lenin and they were crushed. And actually, Lenin himself was shot and almost killed by a woman named Fanny Kaplan, who tried to assassinate him in August 1918.
It's also during this time, the Civil War, that the Romanovs, because a unifying part of the White Army is the rallying around the Romanovs, are assassinated. They're told to get ready, which they do. They're taken down to a basement, and they're all shot. And then they're buried. Their bodies wouldn't be found until like the 90s.
That long?
Good riddance.
Yeah, like I said, I don't generally support like celebrating somebody's death, but in this case, yeah, the Romanovs can fuck off.
Well, there was a prominent Disney movie that was made as well.
Actually, no, Fox made that movie.
Fox made the movie?
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus Christ. I'm fucking up tonight. Well, what way to do it than to kill off any last support for the monarchy than just to ice the Romanovs? Clack, clack, clack.
Right. For me, like, I can never personally support murdering children, but I think the adults should have all been like, no,
Yeah,
I don't
the
want to say
kids-
should,
no,
but like
the kids-
it makes
all right,
sense
the
to wreck them.
I'm not crying because the Romanovs were shot. I'm
We
sorry.
don't want a Harry Potter redemption story right now. We don't want the kids who lit. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
No, we at Mouthful History do not condone the murder of children. And yeah, so if it was just the Tsar, by all means,
And the Tsarina, for that matter.
and ice them both. Ice them like a cake.
Anyway, getting away from the murder of the Romanovs, which I know is bumming out Nick a little bit.
I just, like, we're supposed to feel sorry for these people.
No.
They're the reason that things are the way they
No,
are.
I mean, you know, they had no reason to have done what they did. And
Moral of the story is the hero in your life could be the villain in someone else's. So,
So, kind of going to like the international scene for a second, because the Bolshevik Revolution sent shockwaves throughout the entire world.
In the same way the French Revolution did 100 years earlier.
Exact. And it shook a lot of the world powers of the day. And so in 1918, during the Soviet Union Civil War, a coalition forces of the US, UK, France, Italy, Canada, Serbia, and Japan landed in the Soviet Union to destabilize Lenin's regime. But that didn't last long. They pulled out, and then that's when they put their weight behind the whites. Other than Japan, actually, which stayed until 1922, when the Red Army basically kicked them out. This did make the Soviets kind of wary of the rest of the world, you know, it kind of opened their eyes to the idea that, as they would interpret it, the capitalists of the rest of the world would not want them in power. They wouldn't want them to show that a Soviet republic could exist and exist successfully.
because we have the subsequent Red Scares after this as well.
Yeah. In fact, it wouldn't be until the 30s that the U.S. would formally recognize the Soviet Union.
Yep, and basically as a common enemy.
Yeah.
And so also kind of sticking with the international side of things, and based in part because of the invasion, they established the Comintern, which was the Communist International, which was basically to link up all the European communist groups with the Soviet Union so they could coordinate. So this was theoretically done to just unite communists in Europe with one vision, but, you know, sometimes it did become a place of debate and disagreement. So it wasn't just an extension of what the Soviets wanted. It could be a place of dialogue, but fun fact, it was actually dissolved by Stalin in 1943 because he didn't want to scare the US and Great Britain since they were, you know, in the midst of World War II.
Yeah.
Lenin, he would be in charge post-Civil War.
So the Red Army wins the Civil War.
Yeah. The Red
Let's
Army
get to
wins,
that.
The Red Army wins the Civil War. There's not really much any conflict. Lenin has undisputed control over the country at this point.
And that's basically around the time that his health starts to decline.
And he was never really a healthy person to begin with.
Nah.
Yeah. And so he's, you know, having seizures, or excuse me, he's having strokes. And toward the end of his life, it is kind of interesting. He showed some regret over how central he was to the operation. When his 50th birthday was celebrated on such a wide scale, he was actually pretty horrified by it.
Yeah, because he didn't want to see himself as this godlike figure. He was hoping to just be the guy who gets the ball rolling.
He's like, sort of like Brian in the Life of Brian. I'm not the Messiah. He's the Messiah.
And so a lot of, I mean, like anyone, including his enemies, like pretty much everyone had to admit that he did not use his office for personal gain. He lived modestly his whole life. He cared deeply about the cause. But on the other hand, you know, you do have to admit that he amassed so much central power that it did kind of pave the way for this to happen, and it did set up the groundwork for what Stalin would do.
This is in the same way that it was important for Obama to dismantle the massive spy ring that had been created during the Bush years. And he was told that if you don't, sooner or later, a Republican was going to come into power and was going to abuse that. But he didn't. He expanded it. And guess what? He wasn't succeeded by his hand-picked heir. He was succeeded by Trump, who now has complete control over that spy apparatus.
Wait, Nick, are you saying that the Tea Partiers are actually correct when they compare Obama to Marx and Lenin?
They're right in
Exactly the wrong way.
exactly the wrong way.
So Lenin actually, speaking of Stalin, in Lenin's testament, which was transcribed from December 1922 to January 1923, he actually called for Stalin to be removed from the highest levels of power in the Communist Party because he did fear his ambition and capacity for violence. He was also critical of how bureaucratic a lot of Soviet institutions were becoming, and he recommended they receive some new blood, basically, some new working class members to avoid that like bureaucratic stagnation. But at that point,
He was gone.
He also called for Trotsky to lead the Soviet Union as well.
Yeah, Trotsky was probably closer to what he envisioned as the leader. But yeah, Lenin dies on January 21st, 1924, after another stroke.
So he went bogey. Too many strokes and
A little golf humor for
a little
anybody.
golf humor.
no
Boom.
wonder I didn't understand that reference.
He
And,
double bogeyed.
and honestly, this is kind of where the revolution ends. But I think we need to sum up Lenin and the start of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and I would say there are kind of three big dimensions to his legacy, you could say. So, in terms of the Soviet Union himself, Stalin takes over. And Stalin, being the sly guy that he was, he really, toward the end of Lenin's life, published a lot of material saying that, or implying that he was Lenin's BFF.
And told Trotsky the wrong funeral date.
Such a cold move. Cameron, you want to elaborate on that?
Well, Stalin knew that Lenin wanted Trotsky in power. So he gives the bright idea to tell Trotsky, hey, the funeral is on this day, but then everyone else knew that it was another day. So he wanted to paint Trotsky like some sort of a-hole who didn't show up to Lenin's funeral. So he wanted everyone on his side.
This works, and Stalin eventually wins out and becomes, actually with a little bit of help from Lenin's widow, who backed Stalin initially, becomes the head of the Soviet Union.
And so we go 2 seconds. Trotsky's exiled, goes to Mexico, hangs out with Frida Kahlo, has a little entanglement, and then he gets assassinated with an ice pick.
He lives 24 hours after that ice pick wound before he finally dies.
That's got to be right.
Hey.
And so, in addition to the Soviet Union itself, his influence goes way beyond there. Ideologically, he creates all these new updates, you could say, of Marxism that we've already talked about. And he also inspires so many movements.
He basically makes it okay for less industrialized, poorer countries to be okay moving with their own Marxist revolution.
Exactly. And that goes into what we talked about in our episode with Vietnam, in that a lot of liberation movements in colonized countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, they take a lot of inspiration from Marx and from Lenin.
Yep. Cuba, Vietnam,
Even Mao.
Maoism is basically updated Chinese version.
North Korea?
Not North Korea
Not
as
North
much,
Korea as
because they
much?
have their own ideology.
Yeah.
Junts, I believe it's called.
Juche or Juche,
Juche,
something like that. I don't know how it's
Something.
pronounced, but
Yeah.
I mean, we see like the rise of a lot of left part. Of course, Eugene Debs is way he was kind of came around this time as well.
yeah, he was like late 1800s.
late
early
1800s.
He's not really like a Leninist at all,
But he's still still like kind of the
Yeah.
stroking the populist.
Quite a lot
ideas.
of the socialist movements of Latin America.
Yeah. And even like right now we're talking about the successful movements in places like Vietnam, Cuba, Maoist China. But, there's a lot of movements that have different degrees of success that are influenced by Lenin. And even some of those that don't take power, they help influence their governments. So he looms very large in the 20th century. And I actually had a professor in grad school who said that the biggest ideological battle during the 20th century was between Wilsonianism and Leninism, which we could even do a whole episode about in the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah. Basically, it's not hyperbole to say that Lenin is one of the 5 most influential and important figures of the 20th century. It's through him that the Soviet Union is established. The Soviet Union will become a major player post World War II, and the ideological conflict of the Soviet Union and the United States would set the stage for basically everything internationally that would happen until 1990.
And contextually, like Lenin's message inspired the working class in Russia. Like the Russian working class had really bad, and someone like Vladimir Lenin coming in is like, I'm gonna make it right for you guys, make it right for everybody. It's like if Lenin's offering education, 8-hour workdays, land, who's not gonna buy into that?
Yeah, and just to kind of finish this out, because it's always good to get different perspectives. If you are interested in like a little follow-up material, I would highly recommend a video on YouTube called Lenin versus History. And it's a quick like 7-minute video, and it's part of this really cool series called History Versus. And it kind of has a lawyer speaking like for and against certain historical figures. And so the Lenin versus History video is very fair. And, you know, there's one person talking about the bad things Lenin did, and one person talking about the good things. So if you like this episode, I would always encourage further research in general. But, you know, check out that video. It's 7 minutes, and it's a really good look at the good and bad of his legacy.
I know I personally think that Lenin's a net positive in world history.
I think so, too. I mean, I think that when you're inspiring so many movements and when you are creating a more stable, materially beneficial like thing for your people, system for your people, where people are fed, clothed, have shelter, I think it's net good, even if I don't agree with everything that he did.
It's just populist discourse. Like the discourse is now in the world stage.
I think if Lenin had known that it would have been Stalin and how he would use that power, he probably would have decentralized it a little bit more.
Yeah,
Or
which
could-
it did seem like that's where he was going toward the end of his life, but unfortunately, because he died somewhat early.
You could just iced him. Like,
Anyway, before we go, do you guys want to tell them what they can expect next after this episode?
David has the next episode, so
So I'll basically I'll be going with boxing history, and it'll be about a few different heavyweight boxing champions and why they're kind of surprisingly interesting and relevant to larger historical themes.
And then I got a history that most people don't know about in terms of the Cold War. The Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof gang, a left-wing group that sought to rid the government of Nazi influence post-World
Were
War
they
II.
in Germany?
There's West Germany.
Okay.
And so it's a very complicated group of people, but they believe that West Germany is too capitalist. They tried banning the Communist Party, but they believe that Germany hadn't fully reconciled with their past World War II because there was Nazis and Nazi sympathizers in the government. So
Oh, wait, so this is after World War II.
this is after World War
Okay.
II. So this is West Germany. So
And then after that, I think we're going to take another break, do a movie review, and Cameron has finally convinced us
yes.
to do a full take on the Battle of Algiers.
And it fits right in with our Vietnam episode. So I'm happy.
So, again, thank you guys for listening. Thank you for your support. And we hope, again, like and subscribe if you can.
Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts.
Again, have a great night.
See ya. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for listening, and we just really appreciate it.
We hope you had fun.
Night, everybody.
Night.